Hi, this is Eric Keller for ZBrush Jewelry Workshop. In this video, we're going to continue working in ZBrushCore, working on this Dumbo Octopus ring. So I'm going to start detailing, do a little bit more shaping the head as well. But adding details, I'm also going to add the webbing or that membrane that goes between the base of the tentacles. So a lot to cover in this video. So I'm going to start by going down to the lowest subdivision level. And I want to bulk this head up a little bit because I think it's looking a little tragic, and I like to look more happy. So looking around online at some reference, doing a Google image search for the Dumbo Octopus, I kind of like this shape of the head right here. So I want to imitate that a little bit, get it looking a little bit. The rounder is more appealing. So that's my goal right now at this moment. So I'm going to take the move brush, make it a fairly large size, maybe bring down the Z intensity a little bit, and hold the Alt key and just pull this out to kind of shape this a little bit more. I think if we have this kind of arc right here, obviously that's going to go a long way towards making it look like a happy octopus. I'm trying not to get too far into the land of cutesy, of course. I just want to find a happy medium so it's a nice looking appealing ring. Then inflate with a low Z intensity just to bulk this up a little bit more. Okay, that's too low. There we go. And Z, I kind of hit it and smooth it, and hit it and smooth it to get the shape that I want. And maybe plump it out a little bit more here, sideways. And I think the other thing is I want to bend this back, the whole head back a little bit, so it's not quite that tall. So this is where the Polygroups are going to come in handy. So I'm going to press W for the move gizmo, hold Control and click on the head here. And let's see, I'm going to hold the Alt key so that I can move the gizmo, make it more in the center. And then I'm going to hold the Alt key and click on this little reset orientation icon. That aligns the gizmo with the world axis. Makes it easier to be more accurate in the way that I'm moving it. And then I can do this and just start to move it back a little bit. But what I might do actually instead of that, because I don't want to ruin any of the stuff that I've done here. So I'm going to go into the tool palette, and under masking, I'm going to click on grow mask. And I'm just going to grow the mask up a little bit so I have a nice blur, soft transition. And now when I move this down, I'm not necessarily messing up my the work I did on the legs. So getting something a little bit more like this. Of course, that means I'll have to move some of these legs around like this one, but that's okay. That's the advantage of having the multiple levels of subdivision, because it's very easy to do that in the lowest level subdivision. The next thing I want to do is maybe play with these little fin things, give them a more interesting shape, but also a shape that's a bit closer to the surface of the ring, so they're not sticking out like some kind of jabbing thing that's going to hurt the person wearing the ring. A little bit of an S curve in there just to imply some motion, I think, is also helpful. Alright, so I sped up the video a little bit. I'm using the move and smooth brush to shape this fin, make it look a little bit more organic and natural, like it's a big floppy fin. I'm going to do the same thing on this side, and I'm going to use the mask lasso brush. I'm going to hold Control, select mask lasso from the brush, hold Control, draw a selection, then hold the Alt key and release to invert the mask. Then I can work on this, and then I'm going to switch to Gizmo, hold the Alt key, click on the surface, and then rotate the ear. So yeah, it takes a lot of practice to understand the context of when you're holding Control versus Alt and Control and Shift and so on. So the only way to get good at it is to do a lot. So practice a lot. Switch to a higher subdivision level, and also making sure that I, work on the octopus, seeing it from a distance, so that I'm not always zoomed in too close and I lose the sense of the composition. Of course, the composition is still developing at this point. I'm trying to figure out a way to make these look a bit more organic. In the full version of ZBrush, you can customize the brushes in almost an infinite number of ways. You're a bit limited in ZBrushCore, but you can still get a lot done. It just takes a while to kind of understand the best situation for each brush. Like no one brush is going to do everything you need to. So you get kind of used to switching between your favorite brushes, which in this case for me in ZBrushCore is Move, Smooth, Clay, Inflate, Clay Buildup, and Move Topological. And then I'll also use a Damien standard brush sometimes to define things like wrinkles and that kind of stuff. So even though the Polyframe button is turned off, the polygroups still work. So you can Control-Shift-Click on a tentacle and hide everything else just because I know I've already set up that polygroup. Just because I don't see the color of the polygroup doesn't mean it doesn't work the same way. So I'm just trying to isolate this a little bit so that I can get the tentacle here to not intersect with the eye now that I move the head. All right, so now it's time to start working in the eyes. So I'm pulling out some of these polygons here and creating a kind of a bulge. And I'm exploring shapes at this point. So I'm going to move up to a higher subdivision level, kind of smooth, inflate, hold the Alt key and dig in with the clay brush, and define a cavity so that I can create some shadows that will form the eye. And I'm being kind of intentionally vague about the eye. So just pulling out this little bulge right here and hopefully using the shadows to kind of make it look like the eye actually has different parts to it. But I'm not going to get overly detailed with it because that would be kind of pointless at this stage. And I'm not trying to make a realistic eye necessarily. So adding a little bit of meat here underneath the eye also gives a little bit of a personality and kind of a hints at maybe some kind of octopus-like expression. So yeah, just a lot of smoothing, inflating, going back and forth and up and down in subdivision levels. So I'm using the Damien standard brush to define some wrinkles, but I'm also inflating and smoothing those wrinkles so that they look a bit more elegant. And I'm doing the same thing on the other side with the other eye. So I don't have symmetry on, so these eyes are going to be somewhat unique from each other. So it's important to actually, every once in a while, take a look at the other eye and make sure I'm not going off in some weird direction here that's going to make it look strange or, incongruous. But it's basically the same idea. And I think at some points I had to kind of look at it from the top and make sure that it looks like an eye or a pair of eyes from the top as well. So once again, with the Damien standard brush, kind of defining some wrinkles there, and kind of adding a little bit of meat here to the tentacles. Little bulges and wrinkles to make it look more organic and more interesting, so the way that it reflects the light. And I've already added those suction cups, but now I need to kind of make it more of a transition from the tentacle to the suction cup. So I'm using the clay brush to do this, and then also redefining the little cavity in the suction cup, because every once in a while, with all the smoothing and inflating, it kind of gets lost there. But by creating using the clay brush to create this transition, I'm also creating a sense of rhythm along the length of the tentacle that should look pretty nice from a distance. So it's a little bit tedious. So I'm just going to kind of show you how I did the first part here, and then I'm going to do the rest of the tentacles offline because it does take a while to get all that defined. But again, this is where the octopus starts to come to life and looks more like a critter and less like an exercise in sculpting. So just adding that. And I'm still keeping I haven't used Dynamesh to fuse everything together yet because eventually I'm going to also be adding the geometry for the webbing in between the tentacles. So I keep the tentacles independent from each other as geometry for as long as possible. Polygroups I set up make it easy to hide everything except for the tentacle I'm working on. So now I'm just checking it out in a metal shader from a distance. And I kind of like the way that it's looking. I like the way the tentacles kind of create that rhythm. And then I'm just adding a little bit of bulges of fat here and there. And so that's looking pretty good. Okay, so I spent a little time refining the details and the forms on here, especially with the suction cups. Just kind of creating this kind of blended kind of pattern here. I think it creates like a nice visual rhythm. I just did that with a clay brush, an inflate brush, and the smooth brush, just going along and just pulling things out, making sure the details are clear and look nice from a distance as well. So the next thing I want to do is add the webbing in between the tentacles. And there's so many different ways that you could go about doing this, and all of them, or most of them, are probably equally valid. So the method I'm going to choose is specifically just to show you some additional features or approaches within ZBrush. But it's not the only way to do this by a long shot. But I'm going to use the Insert Mesh brush, that's this one right here, IMM Primitives, to just add some geometry that I can then kind of blend using the sculpting tools, kind of like wedging a little lump of clay into an actual, clay sculpture. The problem is that if I use the Insert Mesh brush, if I select it and click on this, say I want to insert a sphere, I'm going to get a message up here that says the mesh is composed of multiple subdivision levels. Delete or freeze the subdivision levels and try again. What that means is that since I have 6 levels of subdivision, I can't use the brush. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate our octopus subtool. And with this duplicate, I'm going to turn on the solo button. I'm going to set the subdivision level down to 1. So that's the lowest subdivision level. And then I'm going to choose delete higher. So that means that this no longer has any levels of subdivision, but of course I still have this version of it, which does and has all my nice details. So this is the version I'm going to use for creating the webbing. And then I could just get rid of the copy of the octopus and merge the webbing with my other version together. Now what I'm going to do is use the IMM Primitives brush, and the way this basically works is it allows you to add a piece of geometry to a subtool. It's not creating separate subtools for each of these spheres that I'm adding. It's all within the same subtool, and you'll notice each time I add one of these, it masks all the other surfaces. So I could switch to something like this capsule here and start adding this capsule or this extended cylinder. So all these different primitives. And this is really also great for building up hard surface shapes. In the full version of ZBrush, you can actually make your own geometry for the Insert Mesh brush. So it's an extremely useful feature in the full version of ZBrush. In ZBrushCore, we're restricted to just these primitives. So I'm going to undo all that and just select instead. Let's do this polysphere. I'm going to select this and just drag right there, and you can see the rest of the surface is masked. So this is going to be my webbing. So I'm going to switch to the Move brush here and just kind of shape this. Spend a few moments shaping this roughly. And then I'm going to switch to the Gizmo tool. So I'm going to press W to switch to Gizmo. And I'm going to hold the Control key and drag with the Gizmo. What this does is this makes a duplicate of whatever the unmasked surface is. Again, it's all within the same subtool. So this is all part of the same object. It's just a separate mesh that I can then go in here and kind of position. And then I'll press Q for the sculpting brushes, switch back to my Move brush, and just roughly shape this using Smooth and Move to get this kind of stretched feel. And I'll subdivide this in a moment. But I wanted to show you the basics of how the Insert Mesh brush works. As I'm creating this, it's actually creating polygroups as well. So you can see there's a polygroup for both of these meshes. I'm going to Control, Drag, and Release to clear all the mask. And then Control Shift click on this, and you can see it isolates just those meshes because it's their own polygroup. So what I can do now is I'll turn on my original octopus and turn off the solo button, and now what I can do is I'm still working with this subtool, it's just that low poly version of the octopus has been hidden. So I'm going to hold Control and draw a mask around this mesh right here. Control Shift click to bring back everything, and then I'm going to Control tap on the canvas to invert the mask. So now we're back in this situation where everything is masked except for this. So I'll press W for the Move gizmo, hold the Control key and move this over here. And switch back to Draw and use the Move brush to position this. I'm not going to get overly obsessed with getting everything perfect right here. I just need some mesh, little blobs of clay in place in a way that will make it easier to sculpt into the final shape. Of course, the trick is kind of getting this webbing around the coiling tentacles. So I've kind of set myself up for a real sculpting challenge here in sorting all this out. But of course, it's also kind of the fun part. Definitely requires some creativity. Okay, so I've finished adding just some geometry here in between the spaces on each of the tentacles. So now what I could do is I'm going to turn on Polyframe here, Control, drag, and release to clear the mask. So you can see that the octopus is made up of a bunch of polygroups, and then the webbing is also made up of one polygroup. I'm going to go down here and under Polygroups, choose Auto Groups, so that it makes a polygroup for the main octopus and then an individual polygroup for each piece of the webbing. Then I'm going to hold Control and Shift, click on the octopus once to hide everything else, click on it again to invert the visibility. So here are pieces of webbing, not terribly elegant at the moment, but they'll get better, don't worry. So with the main octopus hidden, that's the low resolution version, I can go into the tool palette. So I'm in the tool palette down here in Geometry, Modify Topology, Delete Hidden. That deletes that low poly version of the octopus, leaving me with just this geometry. So if I turn on my other octopus, the one with the subdivisions and all the wonderful detail, you can see now I'm going to keep the webbing as a separate subtool, press Control D a few times to subdivide it, come in here and just start shaping it with the move brush and inflate and clay and so on, make it look a little bit more natural. And I can even subdivide this some more, get up to, let's say 780,000 is fine for right now. That should be plenty to make some nice smooth deformations. Get something that has a little bit of tension to it and kind of an organic structure as well. My main goal is to create some sense of motion or tension in the geometry. And then when we fuse this together with the main model, we'll be able to blend this a little bit better. So I can leave that sort of separate right now. So we'll do that after I do all the detailing on this. So again, using the move brush, the dam standard brush to kind of create sort of a wrinkly kind of look to it. It's along the edge there, holding the Alt key so it pulls the geometry out while I'm using the dam standard brush, and then smoothing it and inflating to make it look like a wrinkle or a stretch mark. Okay, so I spent a few minutes just kind of sculpting that sort of membrane webbing. I subdivided those and sculpted them up, so I think this is looking pretty good. And so now what we're going to do is we're actually going to fuse all of this together using a process known as Dynamesh, which I've mentioned before in the videos. There's a couple ways we could go about doing this. I could merge this model with the webbing model. So this is the webbing model, here's the octopus. So I could just merge these down and then Dynamesh the result. But I kind of I'd rather do it with a duplicate. That way I have these versions as kind of a backup in case I want to go back and change something. I just like having a backup all saved within the same tool. What I can do instead is let's make sure that both of these are the highest subdivision level. And they are. And I'm going to do merge visible. So that's going to merge these two, but it's going to create a new tool here in the toolbox that is going to be the result of that. And I'll just append that to this. So here's the result right here. This is the merged version. It's a total of 6 million polygons. It's not too bad. If we go over here, I'm going to append that. So now we have this as its own subtool. And I'll hide these real quick. So this is a single subtool now with both the webbing and the model. And I'm going to go down here to Dynamesh. And I want to set a resolution, which basically means, how dense are the polygons. The higher the resolution, obviously the more points you have, but the more detail. So I'm going to set this to, let's do something like 300. And I'm going to choose Dynamesh, and let's just check out the result. So the result is actually now down to 112,000 polygons. You can see now the surfaces are literally merged together. So if I start smoothing this, you can see that that membrane is joined in there. But also these, neighboring parts of the tentacle are also merged together. So this is one of the reasons why I kind of leave this to a later point, so that I still have options when it comes to posing and sculpting these separate subtools. So I think that resolution is a bit lower than I'd like. So I'm going to press Control-Z to undo that. And let's do a higher resolution. Let's try 600. Let's try 600. That has a little bit more detail to it. If I turn on Polyframe, you can kind of see the topology of the Dynamesh version. So the interesting thing about Dynamesh is that as long as this button is highlighted, it's in Dynamesh mode, meaning if I started sculpting on this version, like if I pulled out these polygons here, you can see that they're all stretched. If I hold Control, drag, and release, it recalculates the surface, eliminates that stretching. Of course, it changes the point count, but that's the basic idea behind Dynamesh. So what I want to do is go through the model and just make sure that there aren't any holes or big spaces. And I can, here's a good example of a little hole. So I'm going to go in here, use the inflate brush, Control, drag, and release, and that seals that hole. It's okay if I've lost some of the detail. We're going to get that back later when we project from the other subtools. So down here is a good example. So I might fill that up, Control, drag, and release. And you can see now that's kind of closed up. And let's smooth this just a little bit. Connect that a little bit more. Control, drag, and release. Now that's fused together. And maybe in here, I'm going to use the inflate brush. Control, drag, and release. It seals that up. Here's a good example of some holes right there. So I'm just using the inflate brush, Control, drag, and release, and then smooth. You can see that's going to clean that up. And we'll just do the same thing here with the inflate brush. So this is why I like introducing digital sculpting using ZBrushCore, because it really strips down ZBrush to its core technologies. Subdivisions, Dynamesh, Sculptress, Polygroups, and so on. The full version of ZBrush, of course, has many, many more tools and a lot of really fancy stuff that is very cool and allow you to do a lot of things, but for new students, it can be really overwhelming. And a lot of those cool features can get in the way when you're trying to learn everything else. As you've seen throughout this video series, we're constantly using Control and Control-Shift and Alt, and all of these hotkeys have different context depending on what you're trying to do. It takes practice to get that down. So that's why I recommend working with ZBrushCore until you really feel comfortable. And once you do feel comfortable, then you can check out the full version of ZBrush. So when you get these kinds of artifacts right here, like this, it's just basically that the surface has got a little bit of thin. So I'm going to inflate, then Control, drag, and release to recalculate and smooth that out. So that's the Dynamesh version right there. It's all one piece. And then, of course, we also have, I'm turn on the solo button, this version, as well as our skirt geometry as well. So I'm going to save this. And in the next video, we're going to fuse this with the actual ring geometry itself and prepare it for printing.